We're running a little short on time. We'll take a couple questions for Kim and for Lisa, and then we'll move on to our break and our next speaker. Questions? Yes.
So, and the crux of my question may simply be blissful ignorance, but I personally am very excited about what we've heard so far and what's coming. I think we are farther along than we anticipated we might be this year, and what's coming in the next few years. So when I hear Dr. Lin's passion about some of the tests you were talking about, blood tests and such that may be keys to early screening and preventative measures, I'm wondering, how do we balance funding and things for those measures when really the answer is forget about it, just find a treatment and a cure, and we don't have to screen anymore?
The question is, how do we balance, I guess what you might say, direct testing for clinical effects, be it cardiomyopathy or pregnancy, versus the need for, versus the finances and need for research on the, quote, cure, end quote, right now? That's a really good question. I'm glad the people at FARA have that question and not me. And that's an important point. One of the things which goes into all these, and this gets back to a little, I should let you all say if you have anything specific. I guess it really gets back to the question which Giovanni was bringing forward about model systems. Model systems are inexpensive. As Rob said, you can go through hundreds of drugs very fast in them. As soon as you get to larger systems, be they worms from yeast, or zebrafish from worms, you actually then increase the cost more. I think Giovanni called the ultimate model system the human. I'll quote him right there. It's also the most expensive model system. But it's the one which you definitively need, and I think it's actually the topic of my talk later. So it's a balancing act, and it's a very hard question, and you get down to exactly how much cost. Remembering that not everything in Friedreich ataxia will be paid for by yesterday's bike ride, although certainly a lot of it will be. Congratulations, guys. There will be other funding sources, being the federal government, the Muscular Dystrophy Association, and the private sector will be important in those things which have intellectual property aspects, and there's no way around that.
Thank you for your question. I think one of the answers to that is research costs money, it's true, and you do have to prioritize, sure. And if we're stuck choosing between going for the cure and going for prognostic markers, I would probably support, let's go for that cure. Let's stamp out this disease, absolutely. But I think someone else has already brought up that research also has to be a multi-pronged effort, and we can be creative. So in my line of work, I want to look at biomarkers, and I'm pretty good at asking certain entities, can we tack this on to your study that you're already doing? Would your laboratory be willing to run this test to see if there's a benefit in this population where you're already struggling to show a benefit in this other population? I can provide you with very willing subjects if you can pay for the test. So we can be creative, we can work together, and we can find solutions so we don't have to give up one for the other.
Norm, we'll take two more. Let's take actually Mr. Barton up front here.
Hi, I'm looking at my notes. A few questions. I'll be happy to repeat them if possible. Our daughter was recently diagnosed, but looking back at our records, we see signs of abnormal gait going back nearly 3 years. So an initial question I have, and one of our next steps is going to be to see a pediatric cardiologist. What is the propensity for damage prior to FA diagnosis versus after?
Okay. Kim, you want to take
and we've had no communication of heart pains up to this point. Is that necessarily a good sign?
It's probably a good sign. Certainly there are subclinical manifestations, so definitely the screening is a good idea at this point. But I think the majority of cases, the heart manifestations usually, not always, but usually show up after the neurologic manifestations, at least the ones that we can see now. Maybe in 10 years when I have a really good biomarker, maybe we could have detected some higher level that's from the heart at 5 years old. But in general, usually the heart manifestations come after the first neurologic manifestations.
Okay, so after an FA diagnosis as opposed to damage done prior.
Yes, yes.
And secondly, we're at the front end stage. When trying to maintain, and I'm kind of looking that as a primary mission I have, is to help her maintain her current abilities and stamina. Will there be should we look at heart strengthening and stamina strengthening in the typical way in which it's exercises such as swimming or martial arts or walking, or is it a bit of a different approach?
So the question is about, are there things that we can do to help keep the heart function as good as possible, like exercise, and I would say pediatric cardiologists in general are a little bit Jekyll and Hyde about this. We on one hand say, yes, exercise is good, aerobic exercise in particular, stay as active as you can. And there are studies out there, at least in adults and some in children, that show in large heart failure populations that aerobic exercise is good. And then on the other hand, when there's any evidence that the heart is struggling, so if the ejection fraction is down, we also turn around and say, you're not allowed to do competitive athletics. You're at a higher risk for heart rhythm abnormalities, and you have to limit what you're doing. So we say, yes, do it, and no, don't, all at the same time. You have to ride this perfect balance. I think that perfect balance actually is some level of activity, though. We don't want patients to be couch potatoes, because certainly some level of aerobic activity is very good for the heart. Your cardiologist will help you in your individual circumstances assess any degree of risk from rhythm disturbances, from outflow tract obstruction, from decrease in the ejection fraction. Those things can go into the equation when considering what specific limitations to put you or your child under.
And lastly, EPI 743 was mentioned as a second stage idebenone. I don't know if that's available yet, but...
We'll talk about EPI 743 later today. I would mention in the response to the exercise question, in model systems as well as actually in humans, I believe, and Giovanni can correct me, exercise is thought to induce a process called mitophagy, where you get rid of your bad mitochondria and keep your good ones, and that's thought to be mediated by PGC1 alpha. Now, one question from Norm, and then we'll go to break.
Yeah, and actually that's what I was trying to get at too, was the second question, was the prophylaxis of the heart. Your talk pretty much talked about, okay, now you're in trouble, here's the medications. As a parent with a teenager, I want to hear what I can do to prevent that heart. Now, I know you showed the phase 3 of clinical trials for the idebenone that said it didn't work, and anecdotally I have evidence that it does work in my son. Mechanistically, with that smaller heart, it just has to work better in my own mind. So I'm looking for answers on what I can do to prevent me from getting to those medications.
I'll take your question about idebenone and say that after my talk later today, you'll be able to think about that, and that every paradox in idebenone could be understood by the questions of clinical research. So that as to what data is correct, it all is. It depends on the situation. It's easy enough. And exercise, as we mentioned, is the single thing. Very few FA patients have enough hypertrophy where they have outflow tract obstruction, which is a thing which tells you not to exercise. So if in doubt, it's probably a good thing. And also, if you look at the definition of what competitive exercise is, I don't think I've ever participated in it in my life. So with that, we'll go to break right now.